Good afternoon, distinguished guests. It's a pleasure to see full house of people who are seeking for an information about present or actual problems of our, I can say, civilization. It's a nice feeling to see full house of people who are willing to learn more about those problems, thanks to our guests who are visiting our college named CEVRO Institute. Every time it's a pleasure to see people who are, I can say, hopefully hungry and thirsty to get something more, who can enrich their knowledges. But not only hungry and thirsty, but also having enough energy to share it with the others and to share it with us. My name is Ivan Langer. I'm one of the founders of this private college named CEVRO Institute. This college is quite small, but we are happy that we are not too big. We are focused and proposing several study programs on social studies like politology and international relations, public and private law, economics, and by the way, maybe also thanks to my former career, we are focused on security, and you can find a special study programs named Security Studies. And thanks to our no, he is not quite new, he is working here almost 1 year. Thanks to our Vice Rector Tomáš Pojar, we open an, I would say, excellent postgraduate MBA program, cyber security. Speaking about all of this, it's not surprising that today we would like to continue with our cooperation with our friends in Israel and Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. And I believe that it's also not a surprise for you that we have such partners. This college and people who are teaching here, and I believe that also the students knows that we do believe in Euro-Atlantic partnership, that we believe in strong national state, that we believe in such values as our Christian and Jewish tradition, so that the other partner of this college we found in Israel. All together, I believe, can deliver to you a special atmosphere, special afternoon, and I hope that I don't see you for the last time. You are young, not young, a little bit older, if I can see, but still, if you have that energy I have mentioned in the beginning, you're still our potential students. So, I hope that you will not disappear from this wonderful space, and that I will have a possibility to welcome you sometimes as our students. I think that the money you will have to pay for it are a really good investment. Have a nice afternoon. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, let me also welcome you here. Those who are standing and want to sit, so there are still a few chairs left here, so please come if you wish so. I, first of all, would like to introduce this setup, since we will have few presentations now, that everyone sees the presentations, including the presenters. So we will start speaking from the podium, and then for the second half, for the questions and answers session, we will move behind the tables and be in front of you. I must thank, of course, our media partners, but you see them on the screen, but I must thank those who made it possible to have another event in this series. Besides the cooperation with ICT of IDC in Herzliya, that would not be possible without the support of the NADAF Foundation, which is funding this joint project. It would not be possible without Petr Motail and De Conta, who contributed to this event specifically. And of course I do see some others like Luboš Kovařík from Česká zbrojovka or Honza Vrátník from Česká spořitelna, the companies and people who contributed for this series in the past. And of course we will turn to them in 2015 as well. But I encourage the others, if you think you can contribute to bring interesting people from around the world into Prague and to have the opportunity to speak with them and to discuss with them directly, then please feel free and contact us. Without financial support, we would not be able to do it, and we would not be able to host such events at the CEVRO Institute because we would not have for their flight tickets or train tickets, as is the case of one of our speakers now. I must apologize, Noman Benotman. He was the fourth one to be speaking here today. He got stuck with his passport not valid enough in United Arab Emirates, so he's in Abu Dhabi, and I promise, since I know him quite well, that within 2015 I will try to bring him, because he is the former jihadist who has experience from fighting himself, but unfortunately it's not always easy to travel for him, and the passport has expired, so he was not allowed to travel, or respectively his passport was not renewed on time. Yes, we did plan this session on the European jihadists in advance a few months ago, but we unfortunately could bet that it will be timely, because the situation in the Middle East and in Europe is not calming down, and the topic of terrorism, jihadism, the problems with the European jihadists is relevant. It's relevant on the daily basis, and we can bet that every day, once we would be organizing such event, unfortunately there would be something to be relying to, like the attack in Tunisia yesterday, which came to be very deadly. Not speaking of the situation on the Syrian-Iraqi battlefield, not talking about the situation in Libya itself and in many other places, including the European cities and towns where there is also some movement on the daily basis. Before I go, I give the floor to our guests and I introduce them. I will make a small presentation myself, but this is based on the data from the Institute of the King's College and from Peter Neumann, who was to be here also when we were planning it a few months ago, but he had to go to brief the Norwegian government, and since Norwegians are donors and funders of his center, then of course he had to go to Oslo today. But I will use his data to show the picture what we are talking about in numbers and in trends regarding the European jihadists, the individuals born in Europe, at least most of them born in Europe, the individuals with European passports, what is the trend, and to put it into some context. It is based, as I said, on the data of ICSR, which is the International Center for the Study of Radicalization and Political Violence. This is the Department of the War Studies at the King's College in London. The data is from the end of January, so it's quite fresh. Of course, you could probably add a few more cases into the statistics, but it's the best data set what is available. Now I don't know how that functions. Nasměrem. Co mám? A tento červený světýlko? So as a guarantor of the cybersecurity course, you can see that so not everything is in the technique. So what we are facing now? First, the number of foreign fighters is non-stop, constantly rising. It continues to rise. It's regarding the Syria-Iraq theater, but we probably would see the same and will be seeing the same as in, for example, the Libyan theater. The total number as of end of January exceeds 20,000. That's also important, and I will get to that, what it means 20,000 regarding the other conflicts in the past. And about 20% of the international foreign fighters on the ground are of West European origin. You will see that there are some from, let's say, Southern Europe, some from Eastern Europe, but the core of our world is the Western Europe, by the way, not the United States. And it's based on the figures and estimates from 50 countries. There are no figures from Southeast Asia. Of course, the countries where there is significant number of cases, more than 5 were put into the list. Czech Republic is not there. We don't know still about any single case, proven case of a Czech jihadist, someone who would leave Prague or some other towns and go to fight or return back. It's fresh data from the end of 2014. Regarding the Middle Eastern countries, it's a little bit more complicated. If we go to Western Europe and the data from the 14 countries, then the number rises, and we are at the moment counting roughly 4,000 people who have left Europe and gone to fight, Western Europe, and gone to fight for Islamic State, to Syria and Iraq. There are other cases who didn't join the Islamic State, much fewer cases, but the Shiites who went and joined the Hezbollah or the let's say Shiite camp, it's not such a huge phenomenon that these cases do exist. The largest numbers are from the big countries, France, UK and Germany. I will show you the figures, but of course the more worrying situation is regarding much smaller countries like Belgium, Denmark and Sweden. Here, if you see from the back, you see the estimates and the numbers for each individual country. This is the Western European tale, so the total numbers you see here is you have 1,200 from France, you have 500 to 600 from Germany, you have 500, 600 from UK, but if you go to individual countries, then look at Belgium, you have 440. So it's no coincidence that there were attacks in Belgium directly. The attack on the Jewish Museum was carried out by a French national who got back from Syria, but if you see the number of arrests, then it's no coincidence that you see reports from Belgium, from Sweden, etc. You see per capita figures based on how many per million population, and here you have Belgium with 40, you have Denmark with 27, here you have Sweden with 19, and then only you have France, 18, Germany 7.5, so per total population the big countries are not scoring as badly as one might imagine. Let's see the rest of the world, or the world itself. This is the more precise figure of the estimate for the 20,730. And you can see that this is the largest mobilization of the foreign fighters to fight in Muslim majority countries since 1945. In Afghanistan in the 80s, the estimate was it was up to 20,000 and it didn't exceed 20,000. So now we are already exceeding the experience of Afghanistan, and we can debate how much, what were the effects of the Afghani battlefield in the 90s and in the decades to come. Of course, the Middle Eastern countries are of the source of the fighters, and the core source of the fighters is with 11,000, more than 50% of the people we are talking about. The interesting figure for us is also 3,000 from the territory of the former USSR. Here, this is the total numbers. What may be interesting from that, of course, you have countries like Morocco, 1,500, Saudi Arabia is 1,500 to 2,500, Tunisia, 1,500 to 3,000. You can see that again, probably it's not a coincidence of the Tunisian attack. And you have basically all Middle Eastern countries listed. But you can see also Jordan, of course, 1,500 again here, is Lebanon, a small country with 900. And there it is the Sunni jihadists. If you would add the Hezbollah fighters, then regular Hezbollah fighters, then it would come into thousands. But it's a slightly different phenomenon, and not the phenomena of that much of today's discussion and today's presentations. But you can go into, you can see Bosnia, 330, not insignificant number. You can see Kosovo, 100 to 150. And then, of course, you can see the post-Soviet space, Uzbekistan 500 and hundreds in other countries. But you can go to Russia, 1,500 to 2,500, which is Chechens, which is Dagestanis, which is Ingush, Tatars, not only from North Caucasus, but sometimes from the big towns like from Moscow and St. Petersburg. And it's again a very, very significant number. For us, being the NATO member states, then you also should look into Turkey of 600. Again, from NATO member states, this is one of the top figures we could see. All the numbers, it must be said, are the figures of the totality of the conflict from the beginning until now. It doesn't mean that there is now 20,000 foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq. The ICSR estimates that 5 to 10% got killed, another 10 to 30% have left and returned back for various reasons, and we may come to it in the follow-up presentations. So the number of the real actual fighters at the moment, and I mean foreign fighters, not the locals in the Syrian-Iraqi battlefield, is much, of course, lower than the 20,000. Again, these were the numbers of the ICSR report of 2015. If you compare them to the numbers what the same center published in December 2013, so let's say 13 months before, a year before, they have doubled. This is also interesting to see the trends. No matter if the total number is 22 or 18, let's see the trends and where we are heading to, and the trends are really, really worrying in this sense. So I do thank you, this was my introduction to get the picture, where we will get more deeply now with our speakers who came to Prague as far as from Israel, UK, and Germany. Each one will have roughly 20 minutes for their presentations, and then we will have time for questions and answers. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce as the first one Azim Ibrahim, Dr. Azim Ibrahim, who is the adjunct professor of the US Army War College and executive chairman of the Scotland Institute in the United Kingdom. He did serve as research fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He's a member of the board of directors of the Institute for Social Policy Understanding and an adjunct research professor at the Strategic Studies Institute of US Army War College. He has been prolific writer and commentator in Western media as well as on Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, and in other newspapers and forums. Last but not least, he has served as a reservist in the United Kingdom's 4th Battalion Parachute Regiment and holds a degree of the university PhD from the University of Cambridge. Azim, it's my pleasure and honor to invite you to the podium.
Thank you very much. Before I start, I would like to give my sincere thanks to Thomas for inviting me here to speak to such an esteemed audience. It's a great honour and a privilege for me to be here today. So 9 days after the planes hit the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, President Bush stood up in the US Congress. And this was a time when the world was still trying to make sense of these events that seemed too fantastical to comprehend what was going on. So the President, he bent the narrative which shaped the views of billions of people around the globe, try to make them understand the struggle that lay ahead after 9/11. America, he said, was at war with terror. And he was very clear. He said that this would not end until every terrorist group of global reach had been found, stopped, and defeated. Now, this was almost 1.5 decades ago, and today, hundreds of billions of dollars later, millions of lives later, we have more terrorism in the world today, according to the Global Terrorism Index, than we did on 9/11. Of course, terrorism has not been defeated. Last year, a man held up a chocolate shop in Sydney, Australia, whilst at the same time, a gunman entered the Canadian Parliament. And then last month, we've seen 2 of the cartoonists being shot in Paris and people getting killed in a kosher supermarket. Now, all these people, all these men claim to be Muslims. All of them were recent converts to Islam, and all of them reveal President Bush's fundamental mistake. President Bush declared war on the symptom, not on the cause. He declared war on the tactic and not on the motivation. He failed to look at the root cause of terrorism. And this is a fairly conventional kind of analysis. But what I want to do today is something quite rare. I want to take this analysis seriously. Because if you, like me, believe that we have to treat the cause of terrorism and not the actual symptoms, then you have to define what that cause actually is. And this is where most analysts get stuck. Because defining the cause of Islamic terrorism entails entering the murky world of understanding the theological and religious disputes. And most experts of national security and intelligence are simply not qualified to understand the schisms within Islam. And conversely, most Islamic scholars simply do not understand how to keep their countries safe. And so all too often, this debate reaches an impasse. And this is this impasse that I want to address today. I want to address what I believe is the main cause of Islamic terrorism globally, and that is a perverse ideology. It is a perverse extremist ideology within Islam that is justifying this kind of behaviour. Because if you don't look at this, then you have a situation as we have today in the Middle East. By 2007, Al-Qaeda was almost completely defeated in Iraq. It was defeated militarily. But because we did not address the ideological basis, we have it morph into something much more dangerous, and we have something like ISIS today. And I want to sketch out the real strategy, I believe, to combat these ideologies and what they look at, what that strategy will look like. And the stakes are very high. The head of the British intelligence service, MI5, said that there will be more attacks coming in Europe. And today we have a group like ISIS that actually holds territory the size of the UK, that spreads fear and continues to attract recruits, as we have seen in the previous presentation. Now, I want to make this absolutely clear that there is no single cause for people to join an Islamic terrorist organisation. There are multiple factors. These things are based on human behaviour, which does not lend itself to simple prescriptions. There's foreign policy, there's social economic factors, there's alienation, and there's identity. All of these play a part. But I believe these are all secondary factors. These are all exacerbating factors. And the primary cause is this ideology, an extreme ideology that finds its roots in Wahhabism. and jihadism, and I want to tell you a little bit about that. Wahhabism emerged in the 18th century in what is today modern-day Saudi Arabia. It was founded by an individual called Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. He believed that Islam had become contaminated. Islam had become contaminated and it had to be cleansed of all the impurities. So he created a small band of followers, and they went literally from village to village, slaughtering people and destroying shrines. Now, something very interesting happened at that time, that there was a young man, a tribal leader called Ibn Saud. And Ibn Saud was simply a leader of a tribe in the Najdi leader. He basically wanted to bring the tribes together and form a modern state. And the modern state of Saudi Arabia is named after him. So he made a deal with Ibn Saud that I will provide you with religious legitimacy in exchange that you provide me with the necessary support to bring this together. And this is the deal that was made, and this is how Wahhabism became the official state doctrine of modern-day Saudi Arabia. Now, Wahhabism is essentially a cult movement, is an extremist movement within Islam, and it would have remained a footnote in history were it not for a single factor. And that single factor was the discovery of oil. The discovery of oil gave the Saudis literally billions upon billions of dollars to perpetuate their ideas throughout the globe. And this single historical factor is the reason why we see this ideology throughout the globe. Now, Wahhabism went through a schism in the early 90s when Saddam invaded Kuwait. Some Wahhabi scholars said that, look, we cannot have American soldiers on Saudi soil. This is sacred soil, and hence we have to expel the Americans. Other Wahhabi scholars said, look, we must remain loyal to the House of Saud, and this is where the schism happened. Those that said we have to expel the Americans, though this is what we see today of modern Al-Qaeda. Those are the scholars, those are the individuals that formed the modern Al-Qaeda movement. This is very important to understand this, because Wahhabism itself, and I want to make this absolutely clear, does not teach violence. It does not teach violence, but you only need to turn on your TV screen to see what exactly it does teach. It teaches anti-Semitism. It teaches misogyny. It teaches interacting with non-Muslims only in cases of necessity. It teaches that Shias are rejectionists and outside the scope of Islam. It teaches that shrines and other historical monuments are all an affront to Islam and have to be destroyed. So when you see the Mosul Museum artifacts being destroyed, the Buddhas in Afghanistan being destroyed, this is all Wahhabism that emerged from the 18th century onwards. And if you look at the mechanics of how an individual actually becomes from a normal person, from a normal young Muslim to becoming a terrorist, there's a model that was created by a CIA analyst called Mark Sageman, who's probably done the most extensive study of all these people that we've seen that become radicals. It's essentially a multi-phase process. The first phase is when usually an individual reacts to the suffering of other Muslims around the world with moral outrage. He or she will ask himself that, look, why is it that when I turn my TV on, all I see is Muslim suffering? All I see in Palestine, in Bosnia, in Chechnya, in Kashmir, in Iraq, Afghanistan, everywhere it's just Muslims that are being slaughtered. He would then interpret that suffering as a war between Islam and the West. It's black and white. This is clear evidence that there is a war between Muslims and the rest of the world. He would then relate that suffering to his own personal experience. It's racism, discrimination, Islamophobia, or even the inability to get a job despite having the correct qualifications. And the final stage is usually when he or she seeks out a radical network that then cocoon him in a self-enforcing intellectual environment, isolating him from the outside world. But see, the tipping point that takes all these extremists from one end to the other is when he or she starts to believe that Islam justifies violence. So you will have a radical But when he or she starts to believe that Islam justifies violence, then that is what takes them over the tipping point of becoming an actual violent extremist. Now, I want to make it clear once again that Wahhabism does not promote violence, but it lays the intellectual foundations of otherizing other Muslims and otherizing society, so that it becomes a very easy step to go from one stage to a violent extremist. And as one analyst explained, what Wahhabism does is that it lays the foundation and it takes the individual by the hand to the door of Al-Qaeda, the door of ISIS, and that door is opened by these violent groups. So it lays the foundations. But I want to make it clear that Jihadism is distinguished from Wahhabism in 4 central claims. First of all, that Muslims must call for violent actions. So the extremists, the Jihadists, they'll say that, look, it is incumbent upon Muslims to call for jihad against corrupt Muslim leaders. So we have to overthrow these governments. Secondly, jihad can be offensive as well as defensive. So traditionally in Islam, it's only been defensive, but here they say it's actually offensive. Thirdly, they say martyrdom, suicide operations are completely legitimate, which is completely outside the scope of traditional Islam. Suicide in any shape or form is completely forbidden in traditional Orthodox Islam, but Jihadism, it reverses that. And fourthly, they say it allows violence against civilians. So none of these beliefs are actually shared by Wahhabis, but this is where Jihadism actually moved on. And these are mostly completely alien to the majority of Muslims around the globe. But because Jihadism enjoys such a global high profile today, they have opportunists like Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri who are unqualified in any shape or form that take advantage of this. And this is not just, I'm not mentioning this out of a theological interest, because governments like Saudi Arabia do not support and propagate Wahhabism just internally, they do it externally. They literally have $2 to $3 billion a year that they spend to propagate these kind of extremist ideas which lay the foundation for jihadism. And many non-Muslims in the audience may not be aware of this, that the Saudi government is actually spending so much money, and that's not surprising because most of these efforts are targeted at Muslims. Most of these efforts are targeted at to try to bring non-Wahhabi, traditional moderate Muslims into the scope of Wahhabism. So the Saudi government funds scholarships, mosques, institutions throughout the globe to spread this ideology, and they still have a formidable presence on the internet as well. And the central aim of all of this is to crowd out traditional Islam. To mainstream Orthodox Islam is to be pushed aside. So the US declared war on the causes of terrorism, or declared war on the symptoms and not the cause of terrorism. And this is why even if you defeat these organizations militarily, conclusively, they will simply morph into something else. And don't let anybody ever tell you that this is a war between Islam and secularism. It is not. It is a war between the most bigoted and extreme interpretation of Islam and the rest of the world, the rest of the Muslims and the rest of Christians and Jews and everybody else. Because remember, the number one target of most of these organizations are not Jews or the West or the United States or Israel or India. It's actually other Muslims. The number of people that have been killed in terrorist attacks by these extreme organizations, the majority of them by far are Muslims. The number one target is Shia Muslims. They want to wipe out Shiism altogether. So this isn't a war between Muslims and secularism, it's a war within Islam. So the question is, what can Western countries do about this? First of all, we have to move this argument to the center of public understanding. So when politicians and pundits discuss beating Islamic terrorism, they should be discussing how to defeat and the ideology behind it, which provides a soil where terrorism flourishes. And that means discussing our relationship with countries like Saudi Arabia. And many Western leaders, and I'm fully aware of this, I have given briefings all over the world. You know, I've given briefings to the White House, to the Pentagon, to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, to the foreign ministers. Most of the experts are fully aware of this, but there's nothing they're willing to do about it because of the key. Saudi Arabia continues to be a key strategic ally of the West, and many people simply do not want to offend Saudi Arabia because of much larger geopolitical issues. But we need to have a re-examination of our relationship with Saudi Arabia. We need to have a stern dialogue with them, and we need to try to focus our orientation away from supporting organisations like the House of Saud. Because after all, it is the House of Saud that has now become a prime target for many of these extremist groups. And the Saudi alliance with Wahhabi bigotry is no longer the kind of political asset that it was in the past. In practical terms, it means encouraging Saudi Arabia to create platforms for dissent so that Wahhabism starts to interact more readily and more freely with other moderate forms of Islam. Because history shows that when Wahhabism itself interacts with other groups, it also becomes more moderate. We must encourage more cultural exchanges between Saudi's leading clerics and other Western counterparts so that the clerics themselves can be exposed to new ideas and other forms of Islam. We must also alter our diplomatic relationship with Saudi Arabia, and that means moving away from our complete dependence on Saudi oil. And we must ally ourselves with other governments to jointly persuade countries like Saudi Arabia to stop exporting Wahhabism through their embassies and charities and institutions throughout the globe. Third, we must improve our own domestic de-radicalisation programmes in Europe. And that means giving the mainstream moderate Islamic community the kind of tools that they need to root out this extremist form of Islam. We set up an organisation in Scotland called the SOLAS Foundation, and it has been described by the commander for Counter-Terrorism in Scotland Yard as the most effective anti-radicalisation programme in the world. And our strategy is actually so simple that you'll be surprised in how effective it is. We simply educate young Muslims we have 2 leading clerics who basically graduated from Scotland, who went to the Muslim world, studied with the leading authorities in the Muslim world, and they came back to the UK and now created this course. We've had thousands and thousands of people go through this course. These people are qualified in the traditional method, traditional Islamic scholarship. So not even Osama bin Laden could say that these people aren't qualified, because in the traditional Islamic method, it works by a sorcerer-apprentice kind of relationship. You get your license from your teacher gets it from his teacher. So these people have a chain that goes all the way back to the founders of Islam. And the strategy is very simple, is to use mainstream traditional Islam to inoculate, to immunise young Muslim minds against the radical narrative. So when they are exposed to these ideas, they can recognise it for the perversion that it actually is. So when you look at the majority of these terrorists around the globe, a lot of them are converts. And the reason why they're converts is because they have absolutely no idea what Islam actually means, what it actually entails. And even evidence that we've had from former hostages that have come out from Syria that are held by ISIS, they themselves will tell you that these people were actually not very religious at all. They had absolutely no idea about Islam, about the Quran and so on. So it's very easy to manipulate those kind of minds, whereas if somebody has been educated in proper traditional Islam, then you've immunized them against these radical ideas and these radical kind of pictures. We must set up our own kind of de-radicalisation programs, particularly in prisons in Europe, where we can inoculate Muslims against these kind of extremist ideas. Journalists can also help. You know, journalists, particularly in the United States and in the UK, they have this very us versus them narrative, you know, as Muslims and non-Muslims. And this is simply not helpful because it polarises and alienates many of the Muslims and fits into the kind of framework which I just mentioned. But ultimately, this is not a war that will be won by military tactics. It is a war that can only be won on the ideological ground, and this will take many years, and we're up against resources which are very well funded We're up against organizations which are extremely well funded, well organized and well equipped, and we have to the first step is to recognize these organizations for what they are and for what they preach and the poisonous doctrine that they are spreading throughout the globe. Thank you so much for listening.
Well, Azim, thank you very much. Without further ado, let's move it further from the broader perspective of the Wahhabism's ideological ground base and the petrodollars pump into that. Let's go more into the structures of the organizations and the jihadists and their cooperation, be it on the level of the organizational level or the individual level. It's Asaf Moghadam was my professor, so I'm proud to have him here in Prague for the first time. He's a director of the academic affairs at the International Institute for the Counter-Terrorism in Herzliya in Israel. Associate professor and director of the MA program at the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy at the IDC, and a non-resident fellow at the Combating Terrorism Center at the West Point. Where he previously served in a variety of positions, including Director of the Terrorism Studies and Assistant Professor at the Department of the Social Sciences. He is currently also an investigator and research affiliate at the National Consortium for a Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism at the University of Maryland. Asaf has written several books. He has just finished, or he's finishing, a next book. Nothing has been translated into Czech, but you can definitely buy them on Amazon. It's my great pleasure and honor to invite him to the floor. Please, Asaf.
All right. Good evening, and it's really a pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Prague, even though I grew up in Germany, but I'm sure it's not going to be my last time because I already fell in love with the city. So really, it's a great city. And thank you, Tomasz, for your kind invitation. And I will talk today about how jihadists cooperate, which, as Tomasz suggested, is also the topic of my forthcoming book. And so what am I actually looking at? So the main question that I'm after in my book is how do jihadis cooperate, but how do terrorist actors in general cooperate? And I would like to also inquire or examine in my book, how can we actually think about cooperation? How do we conceptualize about terrorist cooperation? So that's what I'm looking at. So why is this an important topic? Well, I think it's an important topic because the main terrorist threat that we've been facing for the last decade or two is the global jihad movement. Right now, the global jihad movement, by definition, is a very broad movement, social movement or network, which is composed of a variety of nodes, right, actors, individuals, organizations. So by definition, we're really talking about a movement where different actors are cooperating, right? And it's a movement that is also constantly in flux, right? So if you look, for example, at the 2011 National Security Strategy, which was in which President Barack Obama wrote an introduction or forward, he says that Al-Qaeda, its affiliates, right, its adherents are the paramount terrorist threat that we are facing, right? And this is a threat that continues to evolve. So it makes a lot of sense, I think, to study how these affiliates and these different nodes are relating to each other. Of course, more recently, we had most recently the affiliation between the Nigerian group Boko Haram to the Islamic State, right? So there are a lot of interesting questions, right? Why do they cooperate? What kind of cooperation is it? There's also another reason why this question is so important is that it can have real effects on international relations and on international events, right? A recent article in the New York Times, for example, said that, as the Islamic State is expanding and creating new affiliates, this could potentially create a new global war on terror, right? So this is clearly a very, very relevant issue. So, how have previous scholars or other scholars, how have they thought about terrorist cooperation? Now, you would think that terrorist cooperation is actually an issue where you would perhaps find a very rich literature. But very surprisingly, there's only a single book that's been written about terrorist cooperation. Now, this book has happened to have been written by a colleague of mine, a very esteemed colleague of mine, Dr. Elie Calmon. And so let's start with looking at how did my dear friend Elie Calmon, how does he classify or categorize terrorist cooperation, and then we'll talk about how this has evolved. So according to Elie Calmon, there are three different ways in which terrorists can cooperate. They can cooperate on at the ideological level, right? Which actually, if we take the latest example of Boko Haram and the Islamic State, this would be a very, very good example of a type of cooperation where Boko Haram has pledged allegiance, right, to the Islamic State. A second type of cooperation is logistical cooperation, right? And logistical cooperation is probably the most predominant type of cooperation, right? It can feature perhaps a softer cooperation, such as transfer of funding, or perhaps provisions of travel documents from one group to another. But it can also involve more harder cooperation, such as, for example, weapons transfers, right, from one group to another. The third type of cooperation that my colleague Elie Calmon identifies is operational cooperation. And this is really cooperation which is used in direct support of terrorist attack, right? So the ultimate example, perhaps, of an operational cooperation would be a terrorist attack that is carried out jointly by two groups. So what's missing from this existing look, or from this existing classification of terrorist cooperation? Now, again, with all admiration for my colleague Elie Calmon, I think that what's missing, I think that this is very helpful, but it's also what's missing from this particular classification of terrorist cooperation is actually, it does not say anything about the nature of the relationship between the groups, right? This is really more a typology of different domains or areas of cooperation. It does not really say that much about the nature of the relationship the two groups can engage in. So if we were to examine, or if we were interested in the nature of the relationship the two organizations can engage in, there would be a number of other issues that we would need to look into, such as, for example, the expected duration of cooperation, right? If we look historically, there have been examples of terrorist cooperation that have been very short in terms of duration. Maybe even a one-time transfer of a weapon, or a single case of perhaps a one-time training of terrorist fighters. At the same time, right, on the other hand, there's also cooperation which is very much enduring, right? There are examples of cooperation between terrorist organizations that have endured for a very, very long time, right? So we have to take that into account. A second issue that we should take into account is the degree of dependence, or the degree of interdependence between two different organizations, right? You can have cooperation between two organizations where actually they maintain their full independence, right? Maybe they have a particular arrangement regarding the border that they draw, right? For example, Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria right now has a certain arrangement with the Islamic State in Syria about where to draw the lines in between themselves. The two groups, of course, maintain their full independence. At the same time, if you have a cooperation that involves a merger between two different groups, then these groups lose essentially their independence and they become fully dependent, so to speak. A third element that is interesting to look at is the variety of cooperative activities, meaning that two groups, for example, they can cooperate on a single issue, maybe a one-time transfer of weapons, or they can cooperate on a variety of issues. If you take, for example, Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, they don't only cooperate on a single issue, right? They cooperate on a whole spectrum of issues, strategically, tactically, financially, ideologically, right? But other groups may only cooperate on a single issue, right? A fourth point is ideological affinity. Now, most of us, right, if we think about it, we may think that cooperation between terrorist organizations takes place only between groups that are ideologically similar in outlook. But that's not the case, right? One of the most important examples of a terrorist cooperation is the cooperation between Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah. Right? Al-Qaeda is a militant Sunni organization, Hezbollah a Shiite organization, but yet they have cooperated. Right? If you don't believe me, look at the 9/11 Commission report, which specifies the nature of this cooperation. So we need to look at the nature of the ideological affinity or lack thereof if we want to understand more about terrorist cooperation. And finally, level of trust. Right? Again, we can think of cooperation as one where there is a high degree of trust or where there is a low degree of trust. Right? In the Cold War, right, the United States and the Soviet Union, they have also cooperated, right, on missile treaties, but there was not a high degree of trust, right? So cooperation can take place along a spectrum of high trust versus low trust. So what does all of this mean for terrorist cooperation? What this means is that I would first of all offer a new typology of terrorist cooperation, which I would say takes place on a spectrum, right? And I would make a most basic division between what I call high-end cooperation versus low-end cooperation, right? So if we look at high-end forms of cooperation, the ultimate cooperation or the ultimate form of cooperation between two terrorist entities would be a merger, right? This would be basically two groups that give up their own identity and they come together, right? And they form a new terrorist organization. If you think about it this way, Hezbollah has been the result of a merger between different sets of terrorist actors, right? Another example is the merger between Al-Qaeda and the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. A second type of high-end cooperation would be a strategic alliance. A strategic alliance would be a very strong alliance between two groups, such as, for example, between Al-Qaeda and its various affiliates, right? Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or Al-Shabaab. And in such a strategic partnership, right, you have some degree, you have, first of all, a larger variety of areas in which these groups cooperate, and you also have, very importantly, you have an ideological affinity. In the low-end cooperation, on the other hand, you don't necessarily have to have an ideological affinity. Right? In a tactical cooperation, right, that's where I would place, for example, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, right, cooperation. I would place this, I would regard this as a tactical cooperation. You can cooperate on a certain number of issues, but you don't necessarily have a very high level of trust, right? Again, Al-Qaeda and Shiite and Hezbollah, probably a cooperation where there is not a high degree of trust. And then finally, at the lowest end of the spectrum, you would have a transactional cooperation, right? These are types of cooperation which can be based around single transactions, perhaps recurrent transactions. Now let me just provide some greater level of detail. And remember that I talked about these 5 different variables before, right? The level of trust, ideological affinity, the variety of areas of cooperative activities, right? So I'm not going to run through the entire list, but just for example, if you're talking about a merger between two groups, right? You would talk about a type of cooperation where the two groups expect this cooperation to last for a very long time. You would have a complete affinity ideologically, right? The two groups would basically have the same ideology. They would lose their independence, right? They would become one new organization, so they would establish a new organization, and at the lowest spectrum, right? If you have a transactional cooperation, then you have right. Then the two groups they maintain their full independence, right? They do not have to have the same ideology. and so forth. In a strategic alliance, again, the best examples, I think, for a strategic alliance would be the alliances between Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, but I think that other examples for a strategic alliance include some alliances that we saw in Europe in the late 60s and 1970s, such as, for example, the German Red Army faction and the French Action Directe. They had a strategic alliance over a number of years. That'll be another example. In a strategic alliance, you have the expectation of a long-term duration of the cooperation, perhaps not an indefinite, but a long-term. Very importantly, you have a very, very high level of ideological affinity. You cooperate on several issues, on at least 2 or 3 different areas, and you certainly have a high level of trust. I think one of the most important distinctions is between a strategic alliance and a tactical alliance. Right? A tactical alliance, here the expected duration can be variable. I think that the main difference between a tactical alliance and a strategic alliance is that in a tactical partnership or a tactical cooperation, this is based mostly on common interests. Right? But these interests can be very subject to change. Right? So again, think about Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah, right, cooperating for a certain amount of time because they have a common enemy. Right? But they might not necessarily see eye to eye ideologically. Other types of tactical cooperations, I think you can find a lot of times between militant actors on a battlefield. Right? So in a civil war, for example, you have a lot of rebel groups or insurgent organizations. Think about Afghanistan, right? The Soviet-Afghan war. At the end of the Soviet-Afghan war, there was a civil war in Afghanistan. You had a lot of shifting alliances, right? These were all tactical in nature because they were always based on common interests. But these interests are very subject to change. In a strategic alliance, these interests are not always subject to change. So if we look at this picture that I present here about terrorist cooperation, and it seems nice and everything, and it sounds academic, and it's, I have this nice chart, but there's something really big that's missing from this picture, right? Something that even this typology, which I have introduced here, which it's something missing here. And the big problem with this typology is that it focuses on terrorist organizations only, right? But if we think about, is terrorism only really carried out by terrorist organizations? Not really, right? Terrorist organizations in recent decades have been more and more carried out, not exclusively by terrorist organizations, but also by individuals, terrorist entrepreneurs, right? Think about the first World Trade Center bombing, 1993. Ramzi Ahmed Yusuf single-handedly carried out, right, the World Trade Center bombing. So we have individuals on the one hand, but we also have loose networks, right? We have groups that are not formal organizations that increasingly carry out acts of terrorism. And if you really want to go all the way, then we also have states. Right? Terrorism can be also carried out by states, or it can be supported by state actors. So if we really want to understand the full spectrum of terrorist cooperation, we must look not only at organizations, but we have to look beyond organizations. We have to look at the changing nature of terrorism, and we have to look at the evolving way in which a growing number of actors now is carrying out terrorism, not only official, formal organizations. So let me just say a few words about what I would call the evolution of terrorist cooperation away from this focus on organizations. And to be sure, I'm not saying that organizations don't matter anymore. Organizations matter for sure. However, I also think that we've focused way too much on labeling these groups terrorist groups. I think that we have to actually label them as terrorist and insurgent groups, because there are many of these contemporary groups that engage in terrorism. They do much more than that, right? They are actually fighting militias, they're fighting armies. So with that said, right, so when I talk about, when I say that terrorist cooperation has evolved, has changed, why has it changed? Well, if we think of terrorism as a phenomenon that is influenced by a broader environment, and if we think of terrorism as a phenomenon that is carried out by certain actors, right, then we can think about the changing nature of terrorism through this lens of how the environment has changed in recent years and decades, and how the actors have changed in recent decades, right? I'm going to focus today only on the changing nature of the actors, because we don't have time to get also into the environment, but importantly, right, so if we focus only on the changing nature of the terrorist actors, traditionally, right, scholars of terrorism have really only looked at, or really have only examined terrorist organizations, formal groups, right? But again, if we look at the broader spectrum of who actually carries out terrorism, it's not only organizations. It's organizations, yes, but it's also what I call terrorist entrepreneurs, and it's loose networks, right? States also, but I'm going to leave states, I'm not covering states in my book because for certain reasons, but these are the variety of actors that carry out terrorism. And again, if we want to understand how these various actors can cooperate with each other, then we have to build a new typology that accounts for all of these different types of actors. And that's what I've done then, right? So we have here a new typology, which both on the x-axis and the y-axis, it looks at the three different types of terrorist actors, right? We have terrorist entrepreneurs, loose networks, and we have terrorist or insurgent groups, right? And each one of these terrorist actors can cooperate with the same types of actors. So if you have, so you can have, for example, a terrorist entrepreneur like Ramzi Youssef cooperating with another terrorist entrepreneur, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, right? The person, the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. Now, I didn't just mention these two names because actually we know there has been a plot that involved these two individuals, right? Ramzi Youssef and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed have in fact cooperated in a plot to bring down airliners, which was a runner-up plot to the 9/11 attacks. It was the so-called Bojinka plot, right? So by cooperating, two terrorist entrepreneurs, they can basically establish a personal cooperation, but they really establish kind of a loose network as a result. We can have a terrorist entrepreneur. Well, of course, we have the traditional cooperation, which is when a terrorist insurgent group cooperates with another terrorist insurgent groups. Basically, the first part of my discussion was that box in the bottom right, right? Organizational cooperation. What we have nowadays, with the changing nature of actors, of terrorist actors, is we have a whole new set of ways in which new terrorist actors can cooperate with each other, and I call these networked cooperation, because I think that the role of informal networks, of loose networks, is becoming more and more important. Much more important, I think, than the role that formal organizations is going to play. So, and I'm just going to, so we have these four ways of cooperation. I'm just going to give you examples just to show you that I believe that we have very good examples for each of these types of cooperation, and then I'm going to talk about the conclusion of my talk. Right, so I already mentioned the Bojinka plot, which was a personal cooperation between two terrorist entrepreneurs. What would be a good example of a terrorist entrepreneur who is cooperating with a terrorist or insurgent organization? Well, the 9/11 attacks. Right? The 9/11 attacks were the result of the idea that a terrorist entrepreneur, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, brought to bin Laden, a formal organization, head of a formal organization. He had a plan, right? He sought funding from bin Laden, and bin Laden gave it to him. The result of this particular networked cooperation was the 9/11 attacks. The 9/11 attacks was the result of a terrorist cooperation. We have a loose network that can cooperate with the formal terrorist or insurgent groups. What would be an example of that? The foreign fighters, right? We have foreign fighter networks from Europe, from parts of Northern Africa, that are leaving here. Sometimes they leave together in groups, right? They go, and they oftentimes join formally organizations like Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham, or the Islamic State. That is also the result of a new way of terrorist cooperation, right? Which would be type 4. We can also have a cooperation between a loose network and another loose network, and I think that the Charlie Hebdo attacks is actually a pretty good example, with a caveat that we don't know everything yet about the attacks of the Charlie. We don't know the whole story of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, but at the very least we know that the attacker of the kosher supermarket, he knew one of the brothers of the Charlie Hebdo murders because they met in prison. And both of them were part of the same network based on the 19th arrondissement in France. And we also have examples of terrorist entrepreneurs cooperating with a loose network. So this, I believe, gets us much, much closer to the actual picture of how terrorist cooperation takes place today. And in conclusion, I'm just going to talk a bit about, I'm not going to talk for long, but I'll be happy to take questions in the Q&A. So what are the main implications? Again, I believe that terrorist cooperation matters. Terrorist cooperation is going to matter more and more because a growing number of terrorist actors are loose networks, are terrorist entrepreneurs, right? The internet and globalization empowers more and more people to become, these jihadi entrepreneurs that are able to support terrorism, to funnel foreign fighters to other places. So when we talk about the traditional forms of cooperation between formal organizations, right, we're talking about inter-organizational cooperation, I believe that the implication for counterterrorism here is that each different type of traditional cooperation between groups can have different responses based on the nature of the cooperation, right? So mergers can have different responses from a strategic partnership, or from a tactical alliance, from a transactional cooperation. But most importantly, really, is the idea that terrorist cooperation is very much evolving, right? Terrorist cooperation has evolved in the last decade or two because of the changing nature of the environment. The social media, of course, plays a huge role also in changing the environment within which different terrorist actors can cooperate. And as a result, terrorist cooperation is becoming what I call privatized, right? So organizations are no longer the exclusive types of actors that carry out cooperation, but private individuals, entrepreneurs, or loose networks play a much, much more growing role in this regard. And this has also important implications for counterterrorism, because counterterrorism, right, counterterrorism analysis, for example, must move away from a narrow view, from a narrow focus on organizations, right? And this can impact many, many different things, including data collection, right? You cannot simply look at the terrorist landscape anymore through the narrow lens of organizations, right? We have to adapt our view, but I can give more details in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And let us move to another layer before the discussion, before the Q&A. The view from Germany, the layer at the individuals and the conflicting narratives of the European jihadists. What they talk about, how is the recruitment, and look more now onto the European soil and what is being cooked and done here. Because to look into the organizations and the ideologies and specific examples and the mutations of the organizations and individuals and the ideologies, and the metamorphosis is instructive into predicting where we may be heading, and not be surprised when we see Islamic State, because, for example, Islamic State has not appeared from nothing. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was mentioned. His history also goes through Afghanistan and meeting with bin Laden, creating a Al-Qaeda affiliate as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but basically he was the first one to establish Islamic State, crushed militarily, as himself being killed by Americans, but the reappearing in a slightly different mutation, his ideology and the whole structure now again on the same territory. So let's move out from the Middle East, more into Europe now, and it's my pleasure to invite Yassin Musharbash, who is a German journalist and writer, who has been working with Neue Osnabrücker Zeitung and Der Spiegel, but now he is an expert and key person in Die Zeit, which is the newspaper you probably, and we probably all know here. He's also one of the founders of the Hate Poetry Project, which started in 2012, and for which him and others got the journalism award. Yassin, the floor is yours.
Thanks for having me. If you knew what the hate poetry shows look like, you would not have mentioned it, Thomas, but if we ever come to Prague, be sure and come, it's fun. The official number we heard about foreign fighters from Germany, the assessment right now, is at 600. I think it's closer to 1,000. I think that in most Western European countries, the people who actually deal with these numbers and put them together privately say you need to factor in a factor of 2, at least. That's the number that we do not know about. The assessments that we have seen today are the ones that we actually can count. So this is actually a really troubling phenomenon. And while I think that theory matters and academia matters, I'm also very glad I'm here as a journalist because I can deal in anecdotes and stories and cases, which sometimes makes it easier. In particular, if you're dealing with a phenomenon where we are dearly lacking data. So we have to look at anecdotal evidence. And some of this anecdotal evidence is what I will share with you now. And just to put this number of German foreign fighters into perspective a little bit more, over 100 of them have already returned, and over 60 of them have been killed. So if you look at these two numbers in addition, you understand why we in Western Europe are having a very critical debate at the moment about how dangerous are these people when they come back. What have they experienced? What may their plans be? How disillusioned are they? Or how active will they be once they come back? So this is something to bear in mind when we look at some of the anecdotal evidence that I will be presenting. Now, as you can probably already see from the two pictures that I put on the front page, if you wonder where I got these information from, it's mostly open source. It's Twitter and Facebook, Ask.fm, other social media websites, it's private blogs that European foreign fighters are running from out of Syria or Iraq. So this is really something that you just need to spend some time with, and sometimes it's useful to know a couple of European languages, but most of this is not really hidden. It's just something that you need time for. You need to invest time. There will be some information that I gleaned from secret documents or from at least not publicly available documents, like court proceedings and police interviews, but I will indicate that just so that you know and can adjust your level of trust accordingly. Now, there are basically three kinds of stories, or three kinds of grand narratives, pools of narratives, I think, that we can identify. The most important, or let's say the one that you can most cleanly separate from the others, are those narratives that are part of the official propaganda of terrorist organizations. So those come in the form of propaganda videos by the Islamic State in which foreign fighters from Europe are made a part, they play a role, they speak in these videos. This is narratives as official propaganda. The audience quite clearly is the adversary, the enemy, us, the West, the Americans, the Israelis, you name it, the Assad regime as well, of course. And who is supposed to be targeted? Potential recruits, mostly. Or us in the sense that we are supposed to be scared. The other big area from which we have access to personal narratives, to narratives at all from foreign fighters, is personal narratives. These are narratives that have been shared by foreign fighters with a lower degree of control by these organizations. sometimes in a phase during their stay in Syria and Iraq where they haven't even joined an organization yet properly. So when they just Twitter along or put stuff on their Facebook website, you would be amazed how little concerned most of these people are with their security. Like I said, they run blogs or an Ask FM. If you don't know it, check it out. They will answer questions. So they will take questions. You can answer. You can go there and put questions to Abu Abdullah al-Britani and ask him, how do I get to Syria? What kinds of shoes should I take? How much money can I earn as a fighter? So that's all available. And that's what I would call personal narratives. And the last area is what I call defensive narratives, for lack of a better word. And this is what they say once they come back and have been caught. So what do they say when the police interview them? What do they say when they are standing in front of a court? Sometimes they don't say nothing, they don't say anything. In most cases, actually, they do not cooperate. This is the German experience so far. But some have spilled the beans, some have shared a certain amount of information, and also during court proceedings and investigations by the police, we sometimes gained access or information about private conversations that they have been having with family members that were never meant to be public, but which are very revealing. For example, one of the guys, I'll be talking about him later, he chatted with his sister regularly. And the police were following this chat conversation secretly. And if you look into that, it's probably the least corrupt kind of information that he was sharing with anybody at the time. So, this is going to be very brief. The official narratives, you've probably all heard about it, it's pretty easy. The Islamic State's media departments, they've got several media channels, media production organizations. They will go to Raqqa or Mosul and pick a number of foreign fighters and have them do a video. We've seen several of these. These are two examples. The bottom one, for example, that's a guy from Germany, the guy with the beard. He was a very well-known militant Salafi in Germany. Then he went to Egypt, lost his wife in a car accident, radicalized more, went to Syria. Now he's part of the German contingent there. He hangs out with a bunch of French guys. And he did a video after the Paris attack where there were 3 or 4 European foreign fighters in a row, each of them, well, basically letting us know that they will take over the world. So this is, when foreign fighters are part of the official propaganda. And of course, they always usually, it's very repetitive, really. It's usually the same kinds of arguments that they make all the time. Everybody needs to join the caliphate. Everybody needs to come and join the jihad. Everybody needs to understand that this is a real state. This is not a fake state. And the West will burn. We will all die. Private narratives are a bit more interesting. And I have separated them into certain subcategories. The first one, because it's the biggest one, are the ones that are affirmative. Even though there's probably no strong control in the moment that these messages were shared, they are still affirmative. And they are not part of the official propaganda, but they support these organizations. They make the claims of those organizations stronger. I'm not going to read out all of them, but I like the very first one. My emir only owns 2 pairs of clothes. Sheikh Adnani's phobe in the Breaking Borders video is years old, and you can see stitches from repair. So somebody's very impressed with the modesty of his emir, right? Then we have answers from Ask FM. Do you get paid at all? Yes, you get a fighter's wage here, so just so you get by. The one that you probably can't read because it's very small. It's somebody giving advice to somebody else who says he wants to go into Syria, but he's got cold feet. How can he, come over that? The bottom one is from a blog that somebody was running where he describes a battle situation in a kind of diary style, very excited, very agitated. He's describing, you run to your room, you get ready, your heart is pumping, you wake all the brothers, you get ready, the enemies are attacking, you jump into the pickup. That kind of adventure story that somebody's sharing, in order to get other people excited, also probably to self-aggrandize what he's doing in Syria. The second kind of private narratives are what I would call informative or instructive. So instructive because they give other people advice, like in the top one, which is first of all in German and secondly way too small. That's from a blog by a German woman who is in Syria, who's giving advice on what to do before you come, how to prepare. Learn about the geography, look at a map, know the major streets. Don't get too excited, because once you're here, you will realize this is real, not everything is going to be perfect, that kind of stuff. There's dozens of pages like that. Then again, 2 examples from Ask FM. Is the training hard? And what does it look like? Depends on where you are from 4 to 12 weeks. That also covers Islamic studies. So somebody is sharing his experience, giving other people still in the West a picture of what they have to expect once they join. The third kind of narrative that is private is what I would describe as casual or everyday life descriptions, like photos like this one. You would be amazed. I mean, they take pictures of each other buying ice cream scones, baking stuff, barbecuing stuff, all sorts of things. In the top left corner, that's in German, there's somebody saying on Facebook, does anybody know some sisters here in Asham, which is Syria, who want to get married? I'm looking for a wife for my brother. Please send me a private message. So there's a marriage market going on there as well. What do you eat mostly? I had pizza recently, a Mexicano, tastes really nice. Here you can get shawarma, falafel, grilled chicken, kebabs, but I prefer home-cooked. In the bottom left corner, they are showing off their new military clothes, which they say they have just been given by the people of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the caliph. Also, the picnic picture from the front page would be, falling into that category. In a way, these are not very informative, but they are probably the truest bits that we can see. These things really happen. People don't think much about shaping a message here. It's just something that happened. Very interesting, but a very tiny group of narratives that people share from there are the ones that I would call critical and or confused. My favorite one is the one that I made biggest. Jabhat al-Nusra in Al-Raqqa attacked us, but Jabhat al-Nusra in Badia gave us a car for free, packed with heavy machine gun. Confusing? Most certainly. Now that's from a British fighter in Syria. He doesn't know what's going on. He has no idea in the world, right? There's more stuff like that. I only get to work as a guard here. That's a complaint by a German foreign fighter. In the top right corner it says, I have heard that you can never leave after you have joined the group formally. The answer from Syria, once you have joined the group formally, you will never want to change again, which is something that, I'd say is ambiguous, at least. Was it hard when you went to communicate with people? Yes, but thank God there was a brother who knew Arabic, so he used to translate. Now imagine that, you go there as a foreign fighter, you want to be part of the caliphate, you want to rule the world, and you don't even know the language. You have to rely on some guy you don't know, if you want to buy a bottle of water. So don't tell me that's not confusing the hell out of you if you go to fight, right? Okay. So third bits of narratives are narratives from investigations. These are particularly interesting because this is stuff that they don't really want to share. They do it because they think it helps their defense. Lawyers tend to tell these people, let them know that you were a tiny, tiny number there, that you were not important at all. Anything bad that happened to you, spill the beans about it, let them know. So this is how we got to understand some things better. One example is Kreshnik B, guy from Germany who has just been sentenced. He got a pretty low sentence, I'd say, because he cooperated. He didn't name names, but he shared a lot of information. Some of what I've put up there are quotes from the chat with his sister that I mentioned. For example, when he said, you understand, I don't want to live in Germany anymore, honestly. This is before he left. Then he says, I don't care what group I will work for. Okay? This is when he was in Syria already. I just had a fight with them. Them is my group, the Islamic State. They said you have to guard the door for 1 hour, but I already had guarded it for 2 hours. This is what he had actual fights about, and they punished him for it. And so, he did not have a lot of fun. Then he started, creating what I think are attempts at a rap song. I chill, I fight, I do my job for Allah. I take my Kalashnikov and Bismillah. So he had a lot of spare time at his hands. That's what he complains about too. He was bored most of the time. I was at the front. One time he was at the front. I was at the front and they shot at us all the time. But I think it is better Mom doesn't know. This is what he tells his sister. We shot at the tanks, but nothing worked. Then the Amir said, I need 4 guys who will go there and never return. So this is the kind of reality that they are facing there. This is clearly not what they expected. I don't believe a word. If they say this is, I knew what I was what I was signing up for, I don't think it's true. Here's examples from another German investigation. I wanted to do something crazy. This is what he said in court when they asked him, why did you go to Syria? I wanted to do something crazy, right? And then he also chatted to people back home. Man, we have mega fitna here. Fitna is fight between Muslim groups, right? So this is what they talk about it when they talk about it and think nobody's listening in. His Amir told him, you are useless here. He then faked an injury to the hand. He went to they had not a doctor, but they had a first aid person in the group. And he went to that person, and that person was an older man, and he was understanding. He saw that he didn't enjoy himself. So he said, can you put a plaster on my arm, as if I had broken my arm, because I want to get out of here. So he faked an injury so that he could go back to Germany, because then his Amir said, well, you can't fight, so go back to Germany, buy stuff for us. So this is what he went. He flew via Amsterdam. The first thing he does, gets off the plane, goes to a coffee shop and smokes a joint. A fighter of the caliphate. Other examples from other countries, we know that a lot of the UK foreign fighters, they mass ordered a book called Quran for Dummies, because they didn't know anything. There's an example from Belgium. There was a guy, and we know there are many more examples. He wanted to leave the group he was with. They just arrested him, put him in a prison, and kept him there for months. There are examples from France, from an investigation where people were fed up. They said, there's too much violence here. They want to send me to the front, even though I don't know how to fight. How can I avoid prison? Now, why have I shared all of these with you? Certainly not to ridicule these people, because personally I think some of them are very dangerous. I made a point of looking into the actual narratives, into what people really say about their experiences, because I think it will help us understand them much better. My personal assessment is that of all those who come back, those who have seen any fighting are more likely to suffer from post-traumatic stress syndromes than from becoming terrorists here. But 10%, maybe 20% will be a severe danger. The others, most likely not, and what we should really look at is that they don't beat up their women and children when they get home, because they're under, they come back from a war situation, and they'll probably need psychological care more than anything else. To sum up, there's strong indication that many European foreign fighters are disillusioned. Foreign fighters are particularly open and talkative very early during their stay. That's also because the extent of control by the group that they join grows as long with the time that they spend there. The closer to the group's center and to the front, the more control over messages and narratives. Men focus on battle experience and politics. It is only, it is seriously, sometimes I cannot believe this. There's a number of German jihadists over there who have, on Facebook, where everybody can see it, published pictures of themselves, with cut-off heads and that sort of thing. So, they are not interested in their security. Or they are very stupid, sometimes both, I think. Women concentrate on lifestyle and atmosphere, so it's usually the women, they run blogs in pink where they say, this is beautiful, this is the life I always wanted, my children are growing up as mujahideen, this is all I could ever hope for. What is quite clear is that religious and ideological knowledge is mostly low. Some of these people would be laughed out of the room by serious people like Osama bin Laden. And they put stuff on Twitter about ideology that just, you look at this and you're like, wow, I know more about that than you do. You would not pass my exam if I ran a training camp. And the military usefulness, obviously, is pretty questionable. To sum up, just 2 or 3 thoughts and then I'm done. A last case that I will add is something that we only learned about in Germany this week. There was a 15-year-old girl from a German family, bio-German family, no migrational background whatsoever, Christian family, from Eastern Germany, where there are no Muslims around. And she is now suspected to be in Syria because she joined the Islamic State. She never converted to Islam. Not that we know anyway. Nobody knew that she did. If she did so, she did it in complete privacy. She never went to a mosque. So, why am I giving you this example? Because I think sometimes this is a puberty problem more than a terrorism problem. If a 15-year-old girl does that sort of thing, it actually, is, I think, important that we ask ourselves what is wrong with our society, as much as we have to ask ourselves what makes this ideology so attractive. And I think looking at both sides of this problem is probably the most important. The question that I will leave you with is, should and can this be exploited? It's an old idea in politics and counter-terrorism that if we know there are cracks in the foundations, there are, people are fighting each other, but they don't share this, there's problems, but they don't want us to know. If we learn about this, should we exploit this? Should we make it public? Should we seek out people who can bear testimony to that? As a journalist, I'm not sure about that, because usually policymakers will then say, yeah, we could use journalists for that. And journalists don't like to be used, and we don't want to be tools. We want to relay the story as we learn it. We don't want to be part of a counter-terrorism enterprise. That's not our job, at least not in my understanding. But anyway, that's up for debate. So I will finish here, and thank you very much.
So, ladies and gentlemen, prepare your questions. I will invite gentlemen to the floor. We have roughly 30 minutes. I will ask the first question, but then there will be microphones. They are already here for your questions. After you introduce yourselves, if you can ask short questions to the point, it would be great. My first question is to Yassine, to follow up now what has been said, but maybe some others, the others can contribute. Is there a typical profile of a German foreign fighter, regional age, socio-economic background, the background of the parents, what kind of first, second, third generation convert? What the statistics show, if there can be some?
One of our domestic intelligence agencies, they did a survey of the personal files that they had about, I think it was just over 100 German foreign fighters, and it was inconclusive. I mean, about 2/3 of them are from families with a migrational background, mostly Turkish and Arabic, but about 1/3 were bio-German converts to Islam. About 80% were men, about 20% women, but there are children as well, which I don't think you could count as foreign fighters. Age-wise, most of them are between 16 and 26, I think, but we have examples of somebody who's in his 60s, and several cases of kids as young as 15 and 16. Most of them have no university degree and no high school degree, but some of them do. About 10 or 15%, I think, have a university degree. So there's a clear cluster, I would say, but but there's basically no constellation where you would say, no, this guy's never going to become a foreign fighter. We've seen also that.
I think this has been one of the errors in terms of trying to pigeonhole entire groups of people to say, well, look, this is a kind of profile and background that if we follow this particular line of thinking, that it will give us an idea of what the kind of model is. The fact is, as I mentioned in my speech, much of these things are based on human behavior, which is extremely complex and does not lend itself to simple prescriptions. People are motivated to go off and join these extremist organizations for a wide variety of reasons. Some of them are basically just social outcasts, and they join for the same reasons that young men in Los Angeles join gangs and do horrible things together, which they personally would not do individually, but they would do it collectively, is because they simply want to belong. You know, they're social outcasts, they're frustrated, and they're alienated from society, and they simply want to belong to something a lot larger. Many are just motivated by the adventure. You know, if you watch some of these jihadi videos, they're like Hollywood movies. 3-4 guys in a topless jeep, you know, driving at full speed through the desert with the guns and everything else, and the music is blaring. You know, it's adventure. If you're a worker that's stacking shelves in Walmart and that's the extent of your ambitions, then, you know, why not just give it all up and go get some adventure? Many of them are motivated by the entire fact that you can go abroad and you get yourself a few sexual slaves. You know, this major sexual exploitation. One of the things I always like to say that, look, when people say, well, look, this is particularly within Islam, you know, Islam is not violent, Islam is not peaceful. Islam is whatever people bring to it. If you're a violent individual, then you become Muslim. You're going to probably go off and join one of these extremist groups because it allows you to perpetuate the kind of violence which you would like to perpetuate. Many of these people, you know, are just thugs and criminal, and if you look at the background of them, they have a history, you know, more likely than not, they will have a history of petty crime. You know, drug dealers, stealing cars, and so on and so forth. They're just outcasts in society. They have nothing going for them, and they're just going to be thugs and criminals, either here or over there. So it really makes no difference at all. But to try to pigeonhole, I think, is a particular kind of mistake, because people from all kinds of backgrounds are attracted to this kind of ideology.
Asaf, you did do a study of these suicide bombers and the profiles. Can you add something?
So one of my, whenever I get asked about the causes for terrorism and the reasons why people become terrorists, one of my favorite statements is that there are as many reasons to do terrorism as there are terrorists. Because I really think that each and every terrorist, you know, he has his own particular cocktail of motivations. And I think it's rare that you know, two people will become terrorists for exactly the same reasons. So I did the study on suicide terrorism that Tomáš refers to. It was one of my early studies for my dissertation. I was very interested actually in why suicide bombers, specifically Palestinian suicide bombers, are becoming suicide bombers. And you know, initially in the first wave of suicide attacks in Israel in the 1990s, most of the people who became suicide bombers, they were young, you know, they were unemployed, they were single. But then in the course of the second intifada, all of a sudden we had people who were fathers, you know, of sometimes up to 6, 7, or 8 children, people in their 40s, people who had fantastic jobs, and they became suicide bombers. And so all of this is really to say that there is not a single profile, and I would even go further and say that there have been a large number of attempts, especially from psychologists or people who look at psychological aspects of terrorism, to find, you know, what makes suicide bombers or what makes terrorists tick, so to speak. And there has not been any really anything that any firm conclusions that people have come up with. I think if I were to say that what is perhaps, you know, one very common occurrence for people who do become radicalized is, I think that there is a certain sense of identity crisis among many, and a search for significance in life, a search for meaning in life. I think that many are going through an existential crisis, but other than that, I think it's very, very difficult to generalize.
If I may, I think the last point that you raised, Asaf, is particularly important, and it connects to the last bit I said about this 15-year-old girl. If I look at the sample of German foreign fighters that I know, all of them had identity issues, and many of them had a past as criminals, gang members, that sort of thing. But this is where the magic and attractiveness of Salafi jihadism as an ideology kicks in. It allows you to reinvent yourself in a matter of minutes. You can become a new person. You're offered a new identity. This is how this ideology works. You can leave behind the past and all the shortcomings of your former life, and you will be a full member of this cult from the very second you choose to become one. So everything in the past is forgotten, it's forgiven. Plus you're getting a set of very simple answers to very complicated questions. So all the questions about who am I, who do I want to belong to, what do I want to do with my life, they answer it for you. And this, I think, this is what we are seeing now in work when we are looking at 15, 16, 17-year-old kids across Western Europe.
So, where do I see the hand? Please.
Good afternoon. Thank you to all of the speakers. My name is Jan Stehlík. I work for the European Values think tank, for the Counter-Radicalization Task Force. Thank you so much to Mr. Azim Ibrahim. I think from your speech it seems that the social movement theory has gained more momentum than I thought. Especially your mention of Mark Sageman was very interesting. If I could, I would probably flood you with questions, although my question is only one to Mr. Ibrahim, because you talked about the importance of Saudi Arabia. And my question is, do you think the global jihad network stands or falls on Saudi support? Or will it continue reciprocally should this support end, fueled by the Arab-Israeli conflict, by the Syria-Iraq conflict, and so on? Thank you very much.
You have a follow-up question to that?
May I add something? I had a very similar question. Azim spoke about the Saudis, how they finance the mosques, foundation, religion or ideology, and then he mentioned also the anti-radical prevent program in Scotland. Am I right? Right. So, is the solution in the fight of money, or because I don't know how we can persuade the Saudis not to stop to finance? So does it mean that if we want to succeed, that we have to put such huge money in program of prevention, or is there any other solution? Thank you.
Okay. Two very good questions. First of all, in terms of the global jihadi movement, whether it will fall or whether it will continue to rise with Saudi support, if Saudi Arabia were to change its position today, the fact is the global jihadi movement will probably continue as it is, because as I mentioned in my speech, there was a schism, but in Wahhabism and Salafism in the early 90s, which has now morphed into jihadism, and that is now does not see the Saudi state as being a legitimate enterprise. So this is continuously morphing, and we've seen the same morphing and evolution going on, from Al-Qaeda onto ISIS, which is much more extreme, that even many Al-Qaeda leaders have disassociated themselves, saying that this is now getting far too extreme. So whether the Saudis stop the support or not will probably make very little difference today. But as I've always said, that this is a long-term ideological battle. It's a long term. This will take a generation to defeat, and this actually links on to the second question in terms of money. Is that you have to appreciate that we are up against forces that are extremely well funded, and money is certainly not the central factor, but it's a very important factor. And I'll give you a very quick story of my own experience of indicating how effective it is. One of the first projects that I was involved in setting up was a small charity in Bosnia in 2003, in which we sponsored young Bosnian students to come to Europe for postgraduate education. So every year I would go and interview them myself, 5 female, 5 male students, and we'd basically select the best out of them all. As the years went on, from 2003, the first time I went, every Bosnian institution I visited, every school, every high school, was begging us for money. They had dilapidated buildings, infrastructure was crumbling, and they just wanted us to help them out one way or another. As the years went on, I realized that they were less and less interested in our money. And the reason why is because the Saudi government had turned up and built a $2 million mosque right in the center of this small town. They gave scholarships to all the male students to come to Saudi Arabia to undertake their education on full scholarship, and then go back to Bosnia, and they have a job for life. They get paid by the Saudi Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Awqaf, and their only purpose is to spread this Wahhabist ideology. And you could see every year I went, the whole environment of that town changing. A small Bosnian town. The young men all started wearing this, the long Arab thobes, the long beards and so on. The young girls, teenage girls, started wearing the face veil. And so, our small charity could not compete against, you know, a $2 million mosque. So this is what they do. They have their ministries. They go around the world in Pakistan and in Afghanistan and elsewhere, and they say, well, look, you don't have a mosque, you don't have a school in this village. You know, no problem. We'll build this for you. And no village is ever going to say no. No family will say, well, look, no, we don't need a school here. They say, look, we'll educate your children and so on, but these are conduits to spread their Wahhabist ideology. So all the extremist attacks that you see, whether it's in Afghanistan or Pakistan, the bombing of Shia mosques, the destroying of music, this is all Wahhabism. This is the same ideology, and this is a very recent phenomena. I just wrote an article about this, which should be published soon. What ISIS is essentially saying, you know, by destroying the relics in the museums and destroying, you know, the historical artifacts, what they are essentially saying is that everybody from the Prophet Muhammad up until today, they were all wrong, yeah, by letting these artifacts survive. They were all wrong, and we are right. You know, so we have Islamic scholars, you know, we have the Prophet himself, we have his predecessors, we have some of the great schools, founders of the great school of thoughts, who all said that, look, we have to preserve these relics because these are a sign of great civilizations of the past that were washed away in history. Look at the Sphinx, for example. You know, Islamic scholars have said that we must preserve the pyramids and the Sphinx as a reminder that this testament and the will of God is beyond any civilization. So we should look at these and think, well, look, no civilization lasts forever, and they'll be, you know, they'll be part of the sands of time. But all of these people, what ISIS is saying, they were all wrong, and we are right. You know, so this is blasphemy of the worst kind. But these ideas, this is happening all over the world. In Pakistan, they're destroying shrines, they're blowing up Buddhas, they're destroying churches, they're destroying. This is all from the same ideas that are being perpetuated around the globe by this extremist ideology that lays the intellectual foundations for this kind of thinking.
Who is next? No other questions? Yes, please, there in the back.
Thank you. My name is Jan Fingerland. I also actually have a question for Mr. Ibrahim. You mentioned that Saudi Arabia, it's about the time to start cooperate with the more moderate Muslim streams. Has that already begun? And maybe another question related to that. What about the religious establishment in Saudi Arabia? Do they have a power to resist that, or are they going to do something about that? Thank you.
So it's another very good question. In terms of Saudi Arabia interacting with more moderate forms of Islam, it's simply not in their interest to do so. You know, one of the questions that I get asked often is that, you know, why would the Saudi government support these Wahhabi clerics? Now, we just have to turn the news, look at the newspapers, and you see the kind of crazy things that they say. You know, that you know, churches should be destroyed, and you know, we should not imitate non-Muslims. You know, non-Muslims are unclean. If we have a football game, instead of 2 sides, there should be 3 sides, because we shouldn't try to replicate. You have a lot of these crazy kind of ideas. So why does the Saudi government tolerate this? And the answer to this is actually relatively quite simple. Wahhabism, you know, the traditional Wahhabism, they say that, look, it is the rulers, the House of Saud, no matter what their errors, like everybody knows, you know, the royal families of Saudi Arabia, the kind of things that they get up to. You know, most of them drink alcohol, which is completely forbidden in Islam. Most of them get up to a lot of non-Islamic activity. You know, but the Wahhabis are literally they are willing to turn a blind eye to this, because very important for Wahhabism is to have stability. You know, the king of Saudi Arabia, in Saudi Arabia, is not actually called the king. He's called the Malik al-Haramain, the custodian of the 2 holy places. And this title actually absolves him, immunizes him against any kind of criticism. So Wahhabism is, you know, the House of Saud gets much of its legitimacy and stays in power because of this kind of thinking. That fact that the Wahhabi, the clerical establishment, is not willing to criticize the House of Saud, because it's much better to have a flawed, sinful king in power who's looking after the 2 holy places than to have somebody come and overthrow him and have chaos. So, you know, for them it's a strategic calculation. You know, we have an ideology here that supports us, irrespective of its flaws, hence why we should continue to support it. And this is unlikely to change in the near future.
Thank you. There is a question in the back.
My name is Kumarwan from the Minister of Foreign Affairs. I would like to ask you about the legal aspect of the whole problem, because basically we don't have in Europe a legal framework how to deal with either those foreign fighters who want to leave, or with those who return, or with the lone wolves, etc. So I wonder, there are either possibilities that the law will be eventually changed, which there are certain steps being taken, but other people also talk about some extra legal steps, like for instance creating European Guantanamo eventually. So how do you see that?
I think I got most of your question, and if I can't answer all of it, then perhaps you have to ask again. But you asked about the legal framework, and your country, fortunately, has not yet had to prosecute somebody who went to fight with the IS, other than Germany. So I can tell you a little bit about the German legal framework, if you're interested. It's forbidden in Germany to become a member of a foreign terrorist organization. So that's the easiest thing. If you know that somebody was a member and he admitted that much by swearing an oath of allegiance to the IS or Jabhat al-Nusra, you can prosecute him for that. The other thing that comes to mind that helps you to prosecute somebody is war crimes. If you know that he, for example, decapitated somebody, cut off somebody's head, that's a war crime. The third thing, and this is what they use most often in Germany because they can't prove the other two, is that you prosecute people for acts of violence endangering the stability of the state. Now, the state that they mean in this case is Syria, not Germany. It's a purely legal thing, because in Syria, in theory, the state has a monopoly to the use of force. The Germans who use a gun in Syria break Syrian law, and you can prosecute them for that in Germany. So if everything else fails, you can always try that if you have a picture of them with a gun. But we are discussing new laws as well, because we feel that it's difficult to prosecute these people, and if we can prosecute them, we sometimes can put them away for 2 years or a year and a half, and if they don't have any priors, then they'll be walking in the streets again after 6 months. So yeah, it is a difficult issue, but I think it is our strength. It is our strength that it is difficult. Ideas like a European Guantanamo, I'm not sure anybody seriously suggested that. I think it's a very bad idea. I even think it's a bad idea to take away people's passports based on the prediction that they might be wanting to travel to Syria. I think it's much better to check our borders better. I think it's much more important to seriously speak to the Turks and ask them to do their job, which is to protect their border to Syria and not just like allow everybody else to go through. That's, I think, more meaningful than having special legislation for a special group of people.
Thank you. Here in the fourth row, Charles Rose. Yep.
Gentlemen, thank you very kindly. Charles Ross, European Anti-Corruption Center. I'd like to thank you for your very balanced and thorough analysis and explanation. Looking from the level of counterterrorism work down at the issues of what are indeed hybrid warfare situations. I think we've seen very clearly in the past year with the Russian hybrid war invasion of Ukraine. I think that we've seen quite clearly demonstrated in the last year with the Russian hybrid war in Ukraine and the illegal seizure of Crimea that the ideological element, the lack of identity, and in fact the concept of many who need seriously to belong to something larger, is a psychological factor we frankly understand fairly well. However, all of this requires very serious money. Setting aside the issues of state-sponsored terrorism, I think the larger bag of money is in fact the black and gray money. I would greatly appreciate your comments, gentlemen, on how you see to address this trans-border issue. Thank you.
Yeah, in terms of the terrorist financing, you know, much of the original finance for some of these terrorist organizations actually came from some of the Gulf countries. You know, one of the things that you realize when you go to many of these countries, that the number one thing that they fear more than anything else, you know, it's not Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Israel or anything else, it's actually Shias and Iran. You know, they have that fear bigger than anybody else. And originally, organizations like Al-Qaeda and particularly ISIS, you know, they made it very clear in the manifestos that our number one target is actually the Shia. You know, they've killed more Shias than they've killed anybody else. And a lot of their funding came from Middle Eastern private individuals, and you can actually watch the videos online that actually say, well, look, you know, before they carry out an attack, thank you so much to brother so-and-so from Qatar, from Saudi Arabia, who financed this operation against the Shias, against what they call the rejectionists. So initially, a lot of the funding came from there. Obviously, when when ISIS began to gain territory, they began to gain with it. Literally, they started robbing the banks. You know, when they overtook Mosul, they inherited, you know, I think some estimates, the $700 million, and on top of that, the large oil reserves. And they, ironically, are smuggling much of this oil out of Iraq and using the same black market that was set up by Saddam Hussein during the oil sanctions that he set up to get the oil out of Iraq into Turkey and all these other countries, and that is being similarly used by ISIS now. You know, the same underground channels to finance their operations.
Okay, last question there, please.
Hello, I'm Lukáš Gurič from the Czech Foreign Ministry. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for a very enjoyable and interesting discussion. My question is a question for whoever is able to answer. To what extent do you think that physical encounters and social relationships based on mosque communities in European countries are central to recruitment of jihadists in these countries as opposed to inter-based and internet-driven relationships? Thank you.
And I would add to that, I had it on my list, like, how do you see, or if there is seen some kind of change over the last 3 years in the activities of the countering that, or in the different narratives of non-jihadi imams, and if there is, what's happening in Britain or in Germany, if there is some kind of change seen in the mosques from that point of view?
You know, this is a very emotive issue. And it's very important that we look at the evidence. The majority of these extremists, the terrorists and radicals, most of them have had absolutely no exposure to mainstream Islam at all. And there was a study leaked by the UK Security Service MI5's behavioural unit, which actually demonstrated that the more practicing an individual is in terms of their Islamic identity, the less likely they are actually to become radicalized, because when they are exposed to radical ideas, they can recognize it for the perversion that actually is. You know, most of these radicals are actually complete novices in Islam, and we've seen that from the fact that most of them have absolutely no idea. Many of them are converts in prison and so on. If you look at the murder that was in Woolwich, you know, recently, the attack, and the 2 individuals were arrested in the UK, when they asked the local imam of the mosque that, look, these guys were from your neighbourhood, what were they like in the local mosque? What were they like in the mosque? The imam said, I have never seen these guys before in my life. They don't go to the mosque. Most of these people have their own minor kind of communities that cocoon them, you know, from the outside world. They don't go to traditional mainstream mosques. In fact, the traditional mainstream mosque is part of the solution. You know, the more we have young Muslims going to the mosque and practicing their faith, you know, in a fashion that is compatible with their actual Islamic identity, the less likely they are to become radicalized. Most of these radicals have absolutely no exposure to Islam, which is why they're so easily they're so easily manipulated.
I'll add two thoughts to that. First of all, I agree, you should start being worried when people stop going to the mosque rather than when they start going to the mosque, as a rule of thumb. The idea that you know, I think it was Sageman as well who introduced the idea of a bunch of guys play a big role in radicalization. That is definitely true from the evidence that I have. It's hardly ever an individual. It's always a bunch of guys, but they don't hang out in the mosque. Usually they get thrown out of there. We know lots of cases in Germany where the imams have said, you don't raise this kind of talk in my mosque. And this is when they start meeting in their living rooms in front of a computer. So that's the story. But I want to add another thought, because Thomas asked what has changed over years, and I think we have to bear in mind that the motivation of those who join the caliphate now is very different from the motivation of those who started going to fight in Syria 3 years ago. In the beginning, the idea of most of those who went was to support Sunni brethren in the fight against the Assad regime, and IS was not an issue, or at least not the big issue. If you go to fight in Syria now, there's no talk about Assad anymore. You do to join the IS. So it's a different brand of people who go now. They are potentially, I think, more violent. They potentially have a better idea of that they will end up with a terrorist organization. Of the first generation 3 years ago, there were quite a few among them who just, you know, they didn't know anything about groups and they didn't care at all. Now, one last thing about narratives, counter-narratives, de-radicalizations, and what are the silver bullets that we have. I want to share with you very briefly one story that I wrote about recently because I found it so impressive. We have an imam in Germany. He looks almost exactly like the younger but fatter brother of Osama bin Laden. He really looks like me. Very, very often people think it's him. They have called the police and told them that bin Laden is really alive and he lives in Germany. So this is what the guy looks like, right? He's got the beard and he's got the traditional dress, everything. He studied in 6 or 7 Muslim countries at very good Islamic universities. He holds degrees in 6 or 7 subjects, from reciting the Quran to tafsir, which is interpretation, to the science of hadith, which is the narratives of the Prophet Muhammad, and all that sort of thing. So he really, really, really is a scholar. He's got 4 wives. He lives in Germany with 4 wives and 20 children, okay? He's a tough sell. It is very difficult to make people like the guy. I like him. He's fantastic. He's very funny. Why am I telling you a story? Because he runs a one-man private de-radicalization program. What he does is that when he meets somebody who's on the verge of being radicalized, or somebody who has come back from Syria, he talks to these people and makes it his project to de-radicalize them. He developed his own program, and what he basically does is he adopts them. They move in with him, sometimes for half a year or a year. He eats with them, they share a room in his house, they play with his children. They don't play anymore because they're 18, but you know, they share time, their free time with his sons and daughters. And then he discusses religion with them 24 hours a day. Whatever question they have about anything, he will discuss it with them. Whatever they have been taught by radical imams, he will dissect it with them, and he will tell them why this is way off mainstream, way off of anything that most Muslims in the world believe for good reasons. This is tedious, tedious work. It takes a lot of time and effort. I visited him twice because I was writing the story of a young guy from a convert, in fact, from Germany, who wanted to go to Syria to fight, and he stopped him. Abu Adam stopped him. And he has been with him now for 9 months. He's making great progress. They both know he's still not over it completely. He still sometimes has, you know, it's like he's relapsing into jihadist mode. But, you know, he's working for his high school exam now. Abu Adam has basically taken him out of the jihadist circles, out of the system. He's changed his mindset. He's feeding him traditional Islamic knowledge. I think if we have one silver bullet, and I'm not saying that as a Muslim because I'm not, but I know it is knowledge, Islamic, traditional, orthodox knowledge. These people are our friends. If we don't like them, we have to learn to like them, because they are better at stopping radicals than we will ever be.
Actually, one of the things that didn't change in the last 2-3 decades is actually that terrorism is really a group phenomenon. We know that, so absolutely, so Sageman, Mark Sageman, whose studies have been mentioned here, one of the things, even before he published his bunch of guys' theories, he conducted a data set, and he said that a lot of the mobilization actually takes place through friendship and kinship ties. But what's really interesting is that actually 2 decades or so before Mark Sageman's study, Donatella Della Porta has done very similar studies on the radical Italian left, and she has found almost exactly the same percentages of people who are joining radical Italian movements. Most of them knew somebody already in these organizations before they joined, and many people knew 4, 5, 6, and up to 7 and more people, meaning that this was really a group phenomenon. So this is something which has not changed over time. That terrorism is a group phenomenon, oftentimes fueled by or supported by friendship or kinship ties. I think that the internet, of course, has social media has changed a few things. I think that one of the main things that the internet has changed is that it has, of course, enabled the ideology to spread much more easily from and for videos and ideological for ideology to be shared. Now, when we say ideology, right? Ideology sounds very, very complex sometimes, but if you really look at it, the ideological tenets that jihadis actually adopt are it's a very, very simple narrative, right? It's not anything complex. It's basically the idea that Islam is under attack by an evil conspiracy of crusaders, Zionists, and apostates, and so you have to defend, a jihadi has to defend Islam against this attack by joining the jihad, which is defined as a militant struggle. That is really the essence of the ideology. So it's a very simple narrative which can be very easily spread over the internet. So the internet has made that change. It has made this ideology much more accessible. However, I would add that for somebody who wants to join a jihadi movement, the internet in and of itself is probably not sufficient in most cases. He still needs a personal link to somebody. But the internet can also help provide that link, or at least say, who you should meet, like Ask.fm and other websites. So,
So, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I want to make an announcement and to invite you for the 9th of April. There will be a debate about Greek Grexit, Greek exit, the Eurozone and the future with Mr. Robejšek from Hamburg, Lenka Zlámalová from the Echo 24. So that's the first debate and event. And then on the 23rd of April, we will have the former Iranian ambassador in Norway, a very eloquent speaker speaking about the situation in Iran and Persia and that part of the world or of the greater Middle East. I would like to thank all of you for coming, but of course I would like to thank Azim, Yasin and Asaf for coming, and I hope it's not been in 2 cases it's been their first trip to Prague. In all cases I hope it's not been their last trip to Prague and to Czech Republic. Really thank you very much for being here tonight.